to introduce Dr. Yarish. She and I actually shared some time at UC Santa Barbara where she was completing her PhD, and we both migrated to Philadelphia within the last few years, although her roots here run much deeper. So just many, many thanks all around. Dr. Jasmine Noelle Yarish is an assistant professor of political theory at the University of, oh, where did my document go? At the University of the District of Columbia and a resident of Philadelphia. She has over a decade of instructional experience in the fields of political theory. Oh gosh, it keeps disappearing, my friend, sorry. It just goes down. Political theory, Black studies, and global studies. She was trained at the University of California, Santa Barbara under Cedric J. Robinson for her PhD, at the University of Essex, home of the Identity and Discourse Analysis School developed by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe for her master's, and at Hobart and William Smith Colleges under Jody Dean for her BA. Her expertise is in the field of abolition democracy, first theorized by W.E.B. Du Bois. Her research aims to extend Du Bois' analyses to include the political and intellectual contributions made by Black women in and around the city of Philadelphia to the era of Reconstruction, 1850 to 1880. Her archival commitments to revisiting that early period of contemporary political thought, the primary democratization period in American political development, and the home city of the United States democracy and rethinking the significance of Reconstruction for the discipline of political science place Dr. Noelle Yarish's scholarship as part and parcel of the growing literature on the third Reconstruction. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yarish and community tonight.
Thank you so much, Sepida and Khalil and everyone for that wonderful introduction and extending the space to me and to everyone to have this conversation around a person who's so dear to my heart, my former mentor, Dr. Cedric J. Robinson. I'm actually going to start our session with a short presentation on terminology, but I want to begin with a land acknowledgement that we're all here in Philadelphia. So, and I think this is really important given the conversation we're having about racial capitalism. So I acknowledge that the land upon which I currently reside are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. I take this opportunity to honor them as the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has resulted in the current iteration of the beautiful Black city that is at the center of my research and which I call home, Philadelphia. In doing so, I identify that settler colonialism and racial capitalism are co-constituent structures of oppression. And I just wanted to make sure that we remember that in our conversations. So I'm going to start with a little bit about some terminology. So I'm going to go to my next slide because what Robinson's doing in the introduction and throughout his book is really trying to get us to rethink what we understand race to be, how race comes into existence and its kind of imprinting in the world as co-constitutive of the imprinting of capitalism as the main economic organizational structure of the globe. So I want to start with racialism, which is the first term that he really introduces in his text. And this comes from page 2 of that introduction. So I made sure I give page numbers here, but I'm going to read this short definition. He calls racialism the legitimation and corroboration of social organization as natural by reference to the racial components of its elements. And he states, though hardly unique to European peoples, its appearance and codification during the feudal period into Western conceptions of society was to have important enduring consequences. So racialism is the legitimation and corroboration of the social organization through inequality, referencing natural phenomenon like skin color or phenotype or body configuration. What this means is that race is the erasure of cultural differences, what we kind of know as ethnic differences. So in the long conversation that he has in part one, which for those who read was not assigned for tonight, but if anybody has questions about part one or want to talk about the first part of the book, I'm happy to do that in our conversation later. But this is where he focuses on talking about the Irish a lot. The Irish were their own kind of culture, but then become white. When we think about Chinese ethnic people, when we just call them Asian, that's the process of race. It's that erasure of that ethnic difference. Not paying attention to Dominican, but just calling people from the Dominican Republic who live in the United States, Latino, Latinx, Latina, that becomes a racial modifier, and us forgetting that other cultural distinction. And of course, this is most pronounced in the Black experience in the Western Hemisphere because of the institution of slavery. So Igbo people, who is a culture within what is now present day Nigeria, become Black. So that is what racialism is, and how race becomes the kind of archive by which racialism gets imprinted. So the next term that I think is really important is to actually think about racism then, because racialism and racism are not the same thing. And Robinson's very clear on this. So racialism is the process, but racism is the aftermath of that process. So it's not simply a convention for ordering the relations of European and non-European peoples, but it has its genesis in the internal relations of European peoples. And this, again, is that moment where race becomes solidified in institutions. So the creation of the Negro through slavery, but also Slav, the term that slave are the contemporary version of slave, or at least the modern version of slave that turned into US slavery or chattel slavery, comes from Slavs, which is Eastern European peoples who were first enslaved in Europe. So he talks about this in a lot of the processes that he looks at. And this is another quote from page 4, where he kind of shows that the creation of the Negro was important for the erasure of not just African history, but the history that Europe had working and collaborating with civilizations already in Africa, as well as in the East, particularly Islam's influence on European economic, political, and intellectual history. So this implication to erase the history to make it very clear these distinctions between Europe and other places of the world where they were once already in conversation. All right, so racialization, racism. That brings us to racial capitalism, the term that we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to unpack a little bit later. I want to give the basic definition that's already in the book to underscore it, and then 2 versions of this by students and interlocutors of Robinson. So the first quote at the top here is the definition that it gives on page 2. Racial capitalism, according to Robinson, is the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. So again, the idea is that racial capitalism is not a type of capitalism, it is capitalism. All capitalism is racial. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, professor at CUNY Graduate School, radical abolitionist geographer, actually makes this more clear when she says that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So because capitalism requires inequality, racism kind of emerged at that time to enforce and enshrine inequality for its maintenance across centuries. And finally, Robin D.G. Kelley makes this very clear when he says capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. That's Kelley's read of Robinson. So it's really a book and a project that is a critique of traditional forms of Marxism and kind of Marxist theory, but it's also an extension of it as well. Okay, so we've covered racialism, racism, racial capitalism, but then what is it that he's uncovering? I was saying a little bit earlier to Duncan that Cedric Robinson was originally trained as an anthropologist. So what he's actually doing is excavating this history that was erased, right? The history of Europe's involvement or relationship with Africa prior to the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, its relationship to the Middle East prior to the Crusades. He's unpacking and excavating this information. And doing so, he finds or locates what he calls the Black radical tradition or Black radicalism. So the main definition of Black radicalism is, he kind of sets up as the obscuring of the Black radical tradition is seated in the West's suppression of Europe's previous knowledge of the African and its own past. The denial of history to African peoples took time, several hundred years, beginning with the emergence of Western Europeans from the shadow of Muslim domination and paternalism. So he's really coming from a point in history prior to the development of capitalism, and saying there was this whole history that happened that has been erased because of capitalism, or our history written through the lens of capitalism. In one of the chapters that you read for today, I think the last chapter, part 2, actually, he identifies three characters, variables, whatever you want to call it, of the Black radical tradition. The first being the absence of mass violence. What he means by that is that whenever there was violence against Black bodies and Black communities in the world through this process of racial capitalism, there wasn't a mass violent resistance, or there wasn't like this resistance en masse from the people who were being exploited. And he does this by doing and showing tons of footnotes about the difference of numbers of when slave revolts would happen, whether that was in Haiti, Nat Turner, other parts of the Western Hemisphere. So that absence of mass violence he embeds that in the footnotes. And I encourage everybody to take a look at those footnotes. They're insane. The second thing that he really talks about is maroonage. And this is what he kind of is developing this thinking about how Black peoples and Indigenous peoples and BIPOC peoples attempted to opt out of racial capitalism's capture. So if the purpose of capitalism is to capture labor from bodies, how do you avoid that capture? By running away. So the history of maroonage becomes very much central to the Black radical tradition. And then finally, of course, insurrection. As I was saying, like the slave revolts or other forms of insurrection. And I think this is a great quote at the end of part 2 on page 170, where he writes, "The Black radical tradition casts doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life, and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience, stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture." So what Robinson's saying is that, yes, racialism problem, racism problem, racial capitalism problem, but it wasn't actually as successful as we think it was. It is highly successful. It has transformed the world, so much so that it's imprinted on the environment, which we'll talk about in session 3. For all of those who are environmental justice questions, please come back to session 3 and we'll focus there on that question. But there is also its failure. And this goes back to the classical Marxist reading that capitalism has embedded in itself a kind of trigger that it is doomed to fail at some level. So those are I'm going to stop sharing this now because those are just my terminology questions. And I wanted to make sure yes, the slides, I will definitely share them. I have no problem doing that. But I wanted to take a minute and see if people had any questions or confusions or about any of these terms before we move on.
Awesome. And I actually, now that I think about it, I don't know if everyone is able to unmute themselves. I'm happy to unmute if needed. If you have a question, though, since we have so many folks on the call, you can just type stack into the chat. That way, it'll be easier for us to keep track.
We'll start with T. Go ahead. if you can unmute and let us know.
Hi there. Thanks for that presentation, or at least the intro to the presentation. That was really helpful. I'm not as far along as y'all in the book yet. I haven't yet gotten to part 2, but I am in part 1, so I do understand a lot of the points you were talking about. My key thing I just want to get clarity on is the distinction between racialism and racism. So racialism refers more to the kind of subreddits of racism, I guess, where it was like distinguishing the Irish from the English, which he talks about a lot in part 1 versus later on where it's just like whites versus black, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to think about it. I always think of race as the artifact of racialization, right? So racialization is the process that then erased all of the history to produce these artifacts that we now know as race. And then they become self-reifying through the systems of institutional racism, if that makes sense. So racialization is the necessary process to categorize people, whereas racism becomes the enforcement or policing of those categories after they're created. Does that make sense, T?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Perfect. I guess Lisa had the same question. Another way to think about this, so there's an additional thing to think about, right? And this is embedded in him focusing on racialism first. Racialism is a process. If it's a process, it's not and its outcome is race, and then racism becomes the reinforcing through policing of those racial categories. Racism is never individual hatred, it's always systemic. So focusing on thinking about racism as a hatred of a certain population towards another one, our famous one, white people against black people. Does hatred exist? Yes, but that's a symptom of this bigger process. Does that make sense? So it's not the hate that comes that produces racism. It's that racism allows for this kind of hate to continue to recirculate and morph and change direction at any given time. But of course, that also means that people will buy into a racial structure. So Irish became white. People of color have also attempted to whiten as well. When we think about the Latin American case, we can think about that. Black scholars have been talking about respectability politics for years, and we can also think about it in that way. So racialization is that process of categorization. It's not just institutions that categorize you. We ourselves in our behavior will buy into, or to use George Lipschitz language, invest in, right? Racial investment, the possessive investment of whiteness that captures more than just people who happen to have white skin. All right, so I'm guessing we're pretty clear on the basic forms right now, right? The terms are basic. So I want to turn now to what I like to call the iterations of capitalism, because the other thing that Robinson's trying to do, especially for those who are started with part 1 and haven't got to part 2, he starts in part 1 in England at the Industrial Revolution, because that's where Marx starts. And he kind of like deposes Marx a little bit by saying, Marx, hey, you got something wrong here. Why did you only pay attention to England or the UK? What, like, you didn't even think about the Irish, which is weird because they're right there. And he so that's Robinson's whole jam for the first 100 some odd pages plus 50 pages of footnotes per part 1. And then part 2, he wants to then unpack that history, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Pretty much to say, look, capitalism didn't start in industrialism. There was an iteration of capitalism before, but there was also something that happened before capitalism, right? That before capitalism even existed, there were trade routes, right? And a lot of times I have these discussions with students and they're like, what's the difference between, why is capitalism so bad? There's always economy. There's always been markets. I was like, yeah, but not all markets need to be organized in a capitalist fashion. I don't need to say this to y'all. You probably know this already. So I'm just going to move into the iterations of capitalism, and we'll talk about that for a little bit. All right, so I got to get out of this presentation mode because that's not helping anybody. And I need to go here, share this screen. Perfect. So one of the things that comes out of the unpacking or the excavation, the anthropological dive that Robinson makes in part 2 is he kind of goes back and shows the formation of mercantilism, which a lot of people think about as the first stage or early form of capitalism. So I'm working to the left to the right with everybody. And so we're going to start over here to this left. Oh, I should get my pen in case I need to draw. I always forget that I have a pen and I can draw on things. All right, so we're going to start here to think about the longue durée of capitalism. A lot of scholars in international relations think about this as mercantilism, and how Marx thinks about mercantilism. Robinson uses Marx's language of, you know, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and starts to name names. Who gets centered in the bourgeoisie? These are people like the Medicis. The Medicis are the ones who funded Columbus. Columbus then goes across the Atlantic Ocean and finds, right, whatever, here, where we are living now. Those would be considered the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, the people that are actually creating the, not creating the profit, accumulating the profit in this very early stage of capitalism. Also, Muslim traders are named by Robinson in part 2 as well. But of course, then you see the other side, the resistors of this. So the proletariat becomes slaves, immigrants, indentured servants, and those kind of conversations hold out in that part of part 2. It's important to note that mercantilism clearly hasn't gone away, right? We all have heard recently about, what was the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal? Ever Given, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit later. I think in session 2, I'm going to talk about these questions of labor unions and thinking about our current iteration of capitalism and racial capitalism. But mercantilism clearly hasn't gone away. We get things from all over the world. There's still capital and profit being gained from mercantilism. But its age of dominance, sorry, loud street. 1 second. Sounds of Philadelphia. All right, so what I mean by age of dominance, and this is me using and extracting Robinson's work, but this is a term that I use, is the age or the centuries when the wealth or the profit that was gained the most by this form of capitalism. So the age of dominance of mercantilism was the 16th through the 18th century, and that makes sense given the history that he's kind of working through. Hopefully that makes a little more sense. The space, I'm going to move on to the space here, of that dominance, or where that capital becomes concentrated, is mostly in Europe. So Europe becomes the center of capitalism and how capitalism gets to mature because of capital concentration from mercantilism really flowing to those spaces. Robinson names initial spaces of resistance. He names Africa, he names indigenous peoples of the Americas, he names people in the Middle East, also in the Far East, he talks about as well. So it's helpful sometimes to create this larger diagram to think through, and when you're reading Robinson, because there's so much detail of trying to track what he's doing. So that would be the first stage, or what we can call early capitalism. All right, so I'm going to move now to the second stage, what we know as mature capitalism 1. And mature capitalism, also known as industrialism, that's the one where Marx starts. So this one's the one that we're most akin to and most understood to be. It's really easy for us to name the bourgeoisie in the industrial era, right? Factory owners, plantation owners. What Robinson's doing is really adding plantation owners to that list, because Marx does not. Marx kind of thinks that the Atlantic slavery and slavery in the United States or other parts of the Americas was more pre-capitalist than capitalist, but we all know that it was the labor of slaves picking cotton that then made the Industrial Revolution happen in Europe, particularly in England around the textile mills. So that's Robinson's important point. All right. Transportation, middlemen also become part of that cadre of capitalists and bourgeoisie, and they might be more petit bourgeoisie than bourgeoisie, but the transportation middlemen is really important. The military becomes completely essential to that category as well in the late 18th to mid 18th centuries. And in the American case, for sure, the railroad companies, first in the United States, but then also all over the world. So again, the proletariat are still similar. We see similar people here. slaves, immigrants, indentured servants, but we add also indigenous peoples very clearly, because from the late 18th century to the mid 20th century in global world history is the golden age of decolonization. Again, Europe is still where capital concentration is happening in the age of dominance of industrialism, but it starts to lose world power status as a result to the world wars, and that's why this ends in the middle of the 20th century. So if we think about this larger kind of history of capitalism, we kind of get here. In his references in part 2, other active spaces of resistance that Robinson notes are places like Ireland, the Caribbean, the South of the United States, right? So like the southern part of the United States, US Indian reservations, but also other colonized spaces in Africa and Asia. Oh, I don't want my draw anymore. This is what happens. I'm going to just move on to the next one. So we're into the third stage. And then what I want to say is this is when Robinson first wrote Black Marxism, it was published in 1980. I'm going to look because I'm going to screw that up. I always want to say 84 and then I get scared that I'm wrong. I am always wrong. It's 83. When he first published or wrote this book in 83, we were in this stage of capitalism, the third stage or the mature 2 stage of capitalism, sometimes known or talked about in the literature as financialism. Other people call it consumerism. So some of the stuff in here I'm actually pulling from other racial capitalist thinkers like Dipesh Chakrabarti, who is a post-colonial theorist from the subcontinent, but has taught in Chicago for a really long time. And I'll kind of explain some of these terms in a minute. But financialism and consumerism, the age of dominance for that is the mid 20th century, right? Taking up from the second stage and goes up to 2007, 2008. Does anybody want to guess what that marker is, 2007, 2008, and why I give it that date? You can throw it in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know.
Seems like most of the answers we have in the chat are tying it to either the Great Recession or the financial crisis.
Yeah, so this would be like the big thing that we know in our timeline is the Great Recession or the financial crisis of the early aughts. So this is definitely that has now become the marker for the end of this stage of capitalism. So thank you so much, Khalil, for that answer. So in the bourgeoisie section, we see bankers, both public and private bankers. So like state banks. So like the National Bank of France is fully capitalist, even though it's National Bank. But also private banks, whether that's Wells Fargo, whatever, think of one, put it in there. We would also consider consumer ones to be capitalist. What I mean by consumer ones are those people who have the purchasing power to buy luxury items and to luxury items in the form of service and goods. So that's what I mean by consumer one. This is a term that I take directly from Chakrabarti. We would add stockbrokers, also the World Bank, IMF, fossil fuel companies for sure, start getting more age of dominance in the mid 20th century, even though they've been around longer. I've also added to this list, because one of my students suggested I do so, coyotes, because of NAFTA. So with NAFTA, we have this kind of rise of other kind of people who would transport bodies, like slave traders in the first stage, but coyotes would be their correlation in the third. Again, on the other side, who are the people that we look to as proletariat? These are decolonization movements. Consumers too are the rest of us who can't opt out of consumption because we live in a system that demands that we survive under really constraining wage power. So we would be considered consumer twos, immigrants, civil rights activists, etc. Notice that the capital concentration is still Europe, but it also then shifts to the United States. And this is because you have the rise of a single world power. And given that capitalism is always a global phenomenon, you have to think about who's controlling the global power lines. So where do we see spaces of resistance? LDCs, also known as least developed countries. That's sometimes the terms that are used. People have called it the third world. We now call it the global south, but also within advanced industrial spaces in throughout the globe, BIPOC and BIPOC communities and other people of color have always been part of that resistance. All right. So now I'm going to move into the last iteration of capitalism, which is not at all theorized in Black Marxism because it wasn't written before this kind of emerged. So I'm taking liberty and applying what Robinson's doing to this stage with the help of a couple of really important scholars that I threw together with you in a short descriptor for this event. So in that kind of description, I talked about Jodi Dean's idea of communicative capitalism, where she develops this kind of concept to explain what capitalism looks like now. That's communicative capitalism. So when you see that, I'm going to write this. This is Dean, Jodi Dean. Surveillance capitalism is Shoshana Zuboff. For those of you who are reading nerds like me, and information capitalism was first theorized before the rest of them by Manuel Castells, professor of communications at USC. So under these different people who think about the late stage of capitalism that we're in now, called information communicative or surveillance capitalism, they're thinking really about how the globe, which is the environment by which capitalism functions, has become smaller. And it became smaller through technology, particularly communication technology and logistics technology. I should add logistics and communication. So the capitalists, the bourgeoisie of our era, the ones that we should be thinking about are the owners of Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, but also the kind of new iteration of militarism, militaristic logistics like Blackwater, Halliburton, the big four accounting firms in the world, fossil fuel companies yet again have asserted themselves even more forcefully. And I've also thrown in Core Civic, formerly the Corrections Corporations of America, the first real private for-profit prison corporation in the history of the United States. And I'm taking that from the work of people like Sarah Haley and Shane Bauer. So those would be most identifiable capitalists or bourgeoisie in our context. Proletariats would be, of course, warehouse workers against Amazon, particularly defectors from particularly Army, but in relationship to these private contractors. We see whistleblowers happening in accounting firms all the time, land defenders, and of course, finally, prisoners. Again, the age of dominance for information communicative surveillance capitalism is since 2008, 2009. And this, we now see for the first time a shift really in where the capital concentration is happening, where profits are being held, still in the United States, but China as well. Finally, spaces of resistance, a little harder to determine because the way in which capitalism is functioning now is much more in the internet, right? We pay each other through Venmo and all other things. But we still see spaces of resistance like online in the form of the rise of hashtagging. We can think about TikTok activism, but also in person, right? The George Floyd protests, 1 Billion Rising, No Dapple, port blockades, etc. So these are like the 4 stages of capitalism, and it's helpful to keep them in mind because that's kind of what Robinson's working through in his text. Again, as I said, this last stage, this 4th stage is not in the text because it wasn't written before this kind of stage really emerged. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about before we get into the Q&A for the rest of our time together, I want to talk about the bonds, because Robinson kind of goes into this. He's saying that there is a bond that is formed between the bourgeoisie to maintain racial capitalism. Therefore, there must be a bond in the resistance as well. So we've seen over time the very first bond that bound the bourgeoisie together. This actually comes prior to Robinson. not prior to Robinson, after Robinson's text, but Robinson does not disagree with this. Sylvia Federici wrote an impressive book in 2004 called Caliban and the Witch, where she literally shows that at the emergence of capitalism in the post-feudal order, the bond that held it together, that made the bourgeoisie form and therefore dominate not just the economy, but also cultural institutions like religion and government institutions like the state, was brotherhood or patriarchy. So the corresponding bond to defeat that would have to be feminism. And that's why we see the feminist resistance of that early era for those who are interested and want to look at Sylvia Federici's work. Another way in which the bourgeoisie has bound together in order to maintain its control over profit has been white supremacy. And that's really the foundation of Robinson's work. So the response to that would be to be anti-racist. But of course, since racism was founded through certain formulations of gender performance, to be effectively anti-racist, it has to be anti-racist and feminist. So that's what the plus up sign is for. This is my little notations to myself, but just think of that as anti-racist plus feminist. And then finally, what is the one that we're seeing now? What is the bond that's making this possible? Because we fought against white supremacy, and there seems to be consensus that white supremacy is bad, save recently. We can talk about that. But for a while, it looked like, we had some consensus. We had some consensus that patriarchy is bad, women have gotten rights, et cetera. But recently we could say otherwise. But the kind of bond that we're seeing more now, I think, than ever before, especially in relationships with the main crisis that I shouldn't say the main, but the crisis by which a lot of others are turning, which is the climate crisis, is the bond of racial capital scene. And that term racial capital scene we'll talk about more effectively in session 3. So stick around if you want to come back. But what does that mean for the proletariat to resist? What kind of resistance needs to be there? So this would be the land warriors, water warriors that also integrate anti-racism, that also integrate feminist praxis. So the bond that bounded the bourgeoisie together across the stages of racial capitalism is inherently intersectional. So the response must inherently be intersectional. So hopefully, I know that that's a whirlwind, a very quick overview, but I wanted to give as much time as possible for us to talk about the reading and anything you guys wanted to talk about regarding what I shared. So we can go ahead to Q&A now, or give people a minute. If you want to go stretch, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, that is also an option. But I will mute myself and let people think and develop questions.
Awesome. And thank you for that, Dr. Yarish. And for those that may have joined relatively recently, if you do have any questions, just type the word stack into the chat. That way we'll be able to keep track of everyone. And we have our first person here, Mike.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I was wondering, in terms of the categorization of different stages of capitalism, what kind of concretely do you think are the, in terms of resistance to capitalism, what do those different modes kind of tell us about how we should be organizing? What types of I guess what's different about those stages, and yeah, how should it be reflected in our fight back against it?
So really good question, Mike. So this comes back to there is not, it's capitalism always feels like this moving target. But if we remember what is the core definition of capitalism, this helps bring it together, right? So the core definition of capitalism is profit over people, right? MCM prime. That's the main formulation that Marx gives us. It's all about profit. People are not even part of that equation unless you find them in the profit, right? The profit is where the labor extraction comes from. We can think about labor organizing. So the story that I'm giving, which Robinson's giving, which is a story of culture. Really, it's culture where we find resistance most effectively, because it was a demand of an institution that relies on the erasure of culture that we can start to see resistance. So what then constitutes culture? Is there something called white culture outside of white supremacy? maybe not. Therefore, really, the capture that Robinson's talking about is you have to effectively target and be white supremacy, right? And how you do that? By demanding that people are people, right? That people are inherently deserve dignity. And I think that that's the thing that's shared by Marx, right? And that's the thing that's shared by Black radical tradition, that at the heart of the problem of capitalism is the erasure of human dignity. And in treating human beings with dignity. So what would it mean to do that? And I think that this longer history throughout these iterations that would require, right, that feminist reflection, that anti-racist reflection, that kind of indigenous land protection reflection. So all of those three things are necessary, because what does capitalism do? It takes gender for granted and then exploits it. It takes cultural ethnic differences for granted and it exploits it. It takes the land for granted and then exploits it. So those are the things that, if we remember, what are the things that are being exploited? Those are the things we should be fighting for. And if we fight for those, we save everybody. Pretty much that's it. I know that sounds very simplified, but I think that it's important to understand this difference of shifting, because it tells us where power is lying at what time and where. And we need that as organizers, right? So knowing what stage of capitalism we're in and knowing where that concentration is happening and how it's happening is essential for how we resist. But the eyes on the prize are, to again cite Ruth Wilson Gilmore, where life is precious, life is precious. Hopefully that answers, but I'm sure it's not an effective answer. All right, next. Who is next?
Hi. Thank you so much. I just have a question about something you said when you were looking at the bonds of across the stages. So one thing that you mentioned was, of course, you said, of course, racism is in some ways formed through gender performance or shaped through gender performance, and therefore, right, anti-racism and feminism needs to go together. I'm familiar with, I'm curious if you could elaborate on that. I'm familiar with certain things that might connect to that, right? The ways in which schools of assimilation and cultural genocide enforce certain gender norms. British laws in India criminalized Hijra and Kinnar communities. But I'm curious to kind of get your take on that, and if you would elaborate on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent examples, and they affect the different parts of the world differently, as you were explaining, Nick, right? Like, depending on how this works. We can think about, there's some great scholars that think about how, the West bringing freedom to the East because they're so homophobic, but actually there's a long history of intergender love happening in the Middle East for centuries before anything that we can think of. So like all of these spaces would be different. But what I mean by that is, I think how I understand it the best is that the body difference between men and women writ large has to do with reproduction, right? Women can make babies. Making babies makes more labor power. So controlling women, controlling people with wombs, I'm going to use that phrase now because there are men who happen to have wombs. People with wombs, controlling their bodies was effective for controlling labor force, and therefore then controlling the lines of labor supply, and therefore controlling potential capitalist profit. So there is always an incentive there. And what Federici shows is she goes back to the witch hunts to really show how this happened, and thinking about it, because the witch hunts came out of a moral panic that was started off by the Black Plague, and you lose all of this labor power, and all of these things were happening, right? Feudalism kind of starts failing. And this has happened in a lot of different spaces. So the body really matters. And that's what feminism taught us. Not that women are important, right, as women and defining what women means. It's that the body matters. And racial scholars have also said that. Why? Because race gets read through the body. So centering the fact that people's bodies and the differences between their bodies can be exploited by capital is what needs to pay attention to. So when I say feminist, I really mean we have to center the body. Does that make sense, Nick?
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and that frames like trans resistance in a different kind of way for me, because it's breaking those categories that are used to exploit. So it's just, I'm getting some new thoughts there.
And that's why I try to go to the bodies with wombs, because, you know, I mean, there are cis women that don't have wombs too, that were born without them. And that doesn't make them any less women or any less, right, as a human. So I would put that there. Perfect. Hannah. I think Hannah's next. Am I right? Somebody could.
Anna, you. Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation. I'm kind of new to this tradition and I'm absolutely not a scholar, so this is very interesting. I guess I have like two things to bring up. One, I really liked your definition of kind of racialization or racism as a justification of social structures that are already there. And I think that has been helpful for me to kind of expand to all other like ideological isms, that they survive and they're helpful in justifying the inequality that we all have to live under, right? So I'm wondering if that, you know, that could be expanded into sexism and the gender differences that you're already kind of talking about. But under that though, like nationalism, I think comes up for me as well.
Yes.
And I was surprised that you said that Marx didn't seem to talk about the Irish, because I've read Marx's comments about the Irish nationalist struggle, and he has a lot to say about that. So I don't know if you could like explain why that it comes up. The second thing, I think I have a bit of a confusion about the different phases of capitalism that you kind of laid out. Specifically, the way that I've understood the difference between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat class. Because for me, it isn't like a sense looking at who physically produces for society so that we all can survive, and who owns the means by which we produce those things, and then gets to decide how those things are distributed and how people are paid in exchange for their labor, et cetera, and so forth. And it seems like the different categories you gave were more focused on what you were talking about, actually, was who's resisting and who's profiting. But I don't know, I guess in my mind, I don't know if that always lines up perfectly in terms of like, I guess in what would be called the classical Marxist sense of who's literally producing the means of society's survival. Because I think also those aren't always the people who are always resisting. And that's kind of the contradictions of like consciousness and ideology and like all that other stuff that gets wrapped up into it. So I would really appreciate it if you could address those those overlapping concerns. Thanks.
Very excellent questions. Thank you, Hannah, very much. I think both of them are very important. And I'll actually start with the second one, because I think that's probably easier for me to do right away. So the thing that I probably should have said earlier, and I didn't, that I'm taking for granted, is that I'm centering, like Robinson does, the case of the slave as the foundation for the story of capitalism. If capitalism is racial capitalism, the process of racial capitalism is built through the modern turn towards slavery. Modern slavery is different from ancient slavery. Ancient slavery was determined by warfare way more than it was around profit seeking and selling of bodies, right? If like, think of like the Roman tradition, Rome would invade somewhere, kill all the men, enslave the women, bring them back to Rome. But then they would become servants or slaves in that kind of way, domestic, but they weren't then sold somewhere else, right? There was no middlemen, really. There were the soldiers, and they brought them back, and then they were sold only to the citizens of Rome, and only Roman citizens could buy slaves and own slaves. So a different kind of story. So by centering the slave experience, particularly the Black slave experience, we have to remember that the Black slave in the Atlantic slave trade confounds traditional Marxist analysis. It confounds it for two reasons. It's not a clear distinction that slaves, chattel slaves, were labor only or capital only. They were both. They were, to cite Du Bois, real estate in the flesh. Okay, so they were labor and capital simultaneously. And in doing so, it confounds the kind of tradition and logic of Marx. So if that is true, then slave catchers, slave transporters, slave minders, police officers are all capitalists, are all bourgeoisie. If you use the racial capitalism lens, does that help, Hannah? So then police officers, prison guards, coyotes. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so that's the reason why I was doing it the way I was doing it, using racial capitalism as opposed to the traditional Marxist analysis. And I'm happy to amend it. That's why I'm always doing it with students. Like I teach this a lot of times, and I will amend this if somebody can make the argument, and we can. But the lines are blurry. But the lines are blurry because the lines are blurry. It's the forcing of them to be clear that actually helps capitalists, not us. The more we blur those lines, the better off we get. Sometimes is what Robinson would say, right? And somebody can clarify that for me later, because I know that she remembers a little bit of Cedric, just a little. All right, so the first question you had about nationalism, and I'm gonna step back and talk a little bit about ideology for a second. So capitalism, feudalism are economic ideologies. Liberalism, conservatism, socialism, political ideologies. Nationalism, populism, environmentalism, material ideologies. So what does it mean for me to categorize in that way? It's really important. Political ideologies answer one question and one question only. What is the purpose of government? Economic ideologies answer one question and one question only. What is the purpose of the market? Capitalism, profit, right? Makes sense. Feudalism, maintain the lords, right? Nationalism is a material ideology that asks the question, what is the purpose of a particular materiality in the world? The materiality that we now know as the nation, right? Or populism, the people as a material function. So it makes sense that Marx was talking about nationalism, right? Why? Because he's a materialist. He's a Hegelian who thinks about materialism, and we have to understand the world and its functions through material lenses. And the nation is something we should never take for granted. So the question of nationalism is really important. So when you talk about how Marx was talking about the Irish nationalist, he was talking about the Irish resistance, but he wasn't talking about the Irish's racialization. And that's what Robinson adds to the conversation. Does that make sense, Hannah?
Yeah, it makes sense, but I don't mean to be contrarian, but
No.
There is really, I mean, he doesn't write extensively about it, and he never published books on it, but I have seen comments he would make maybe in footnotes or in letters to other communists in terms of what he's even comparing what he sees as like a nationalist identity against the Irish in the UK compared to what he saw happening in the Atlantic slave trade as well, and that same kind of ideological process.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that I think what Robinson's doing is, he still names it Black Marxism for a reason. It is a critique of Marx, but it's also an extension of Marx into the areas that Marx just didn't get to. And, we can't all get to everything. We're imperfect, we're human. And Marx was a completely flawed human.
Absolutely.
And we want to enjoy him in his flawedness, because I think if we start to make certain people not flawed, we run the trap of becoming fascists. Another political ideology. But hopefully that helps. All right.
Thank you.
Jim, you're next.
Hey, thanks for this presentation. Very, very insightful and helpful. So one thing that I guess I put myself on stack for was something you had mentioned when you were commenting back to Mike earlier. You were saying basically that the idea is that all humans inherently deserve dignity, and absolutely, like I agree with that. And I'm just trying to, it's funny because like, I guess this whole thing is about racial capitalism, and we've touched on some feminism and homophobia and transphobia. Is there some sort of like, I guess my question is like, it's almost like we can see from afar somebody is a different color, so they're easier to spot and like you said, to like segregate, and like we know capitalists are this side and bourgeoisie are this side. So I guess like as we keep fighting for different groups to sort of become that the equality that they deserve, then is there always going to be a trickle down of some other marginalized group that like, because behind that is the ableism, and behind that is the ageism and whatever else, like, and then it kind of like gets smaller and smaller groups maybe, or like just different ways to cut the population, I suppose. So
Right. And then it's just reduced down to the individual, which gets us back into the liberal hole. Yeah, that's a good question. That is a very fine, it's an excellent question. And this is a question that a lot of, I won't say socialists, but at least communist scholars are thinking about when they critique something like intersectionality, right? The project of intersectionality. So what I would say, and what I think is important for me, and why do I prioritize race over everything else, is because race was created through gendered articulations, right? Taking away a certain kind of, or not taking away, let me put it this way, like Black women could never be women because they were chattel, right? And then being chattel is also an ableist kind of question, right? Certain bodies were only valuable as long as they could produce. The moment they become defective, they can be completely thrown out, castigated, killed, whatever, right? Left to die. So what's really fascinating is that so many of these other factors, right? These discriminating factors can circle around how race was theorized in the first place. So if you go back and read racial scientists, right, those original racists from the 17th century, they talk about these bodies as monstrous, right? We use the same language when we talk about trans people today. That is inherently a racialized language to talk about people determined by their sexuality, not prioritizing race, but the language is there. So one of the things, race is a slippery concept, right? That's why I talked about racialism versus racism. It's slippery. And in Robinson's his late work, his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, he literally calls race a conceit, right? It's something that is always slipping. So we're never going to be perfect because we're inhuman. But I think one of the things that we have to recognize is what is the difference between discrimination and prejudice? And what is the difference then again, like, is all discrimination problematic? I discriminate when I go to the doctor and I want a female doctor because I feel more comfortable. Does that make me then an oppressor? No, because in order for me to be an oppressor, I'd have to be in a position of power. We're just talking about me choosing a doctor here. However, let's put it this way, bias that we see, like you were talking about people across the street, where does that bias come from? If it's based in stereotypes told to you by other people, you're reinforcing racism. When it's based on something that happened to you, that's then bias that could be potentially problematic. So for example, every time I see a white man, I'm terrified because I was beaten by my white father. Good example, right? So therefore all white men I see as dangerous. That is moving from my bias based on experience, based on like gut experience, to something else. But being told, right, Black people are dangerous by media, and then we internalize that and then project it, that's a whole other story. What makes that possible? That has everything more to do with communicative capitalism and these other structures. So for me, I think it's important for us to remember that systems of oppression can only be changed systematically. Individual forms of resistance don't actually get us very far. But being conscious of it, right? This goes back to Marx. Being conscious of these things as actually happening is a good first step. So I think that's where I would start with it. So if you're really interested in ableism and its history and racialization, a ton of books I can send you. There's so much reading out there that's really helpful. But one of the ones that, particularly around gender and the fact that Black men have been either rendered effeminate or overly hyperly masculine, there's some really good text out there, including The Man Not by Tommy Curry, which is an excellent place to start if you want to really think about Black masculinity. And then the questions there. When it comes to Black feminism, there's a whole gamut of things I could talk about as well. But if you really want to think about it that way, I think that's helpful. Okay, I know there's a lot of questions, so I don't want to.
Thank you.
I don't want to. Oh, Chaz, thank you so much. Chaz is my colleague and good friend from the Abolition Collective. Thank you, Chaz. That's very helpful. All right, who did I miss? Kelsey. Oh, Nick, Hannah, you were just telling me. Lisa. Lisa's next, I'm guessing.
Hi. You talked about the process of racialization as a justification for exploiting workers. I know that I've heard other scholars, I'm not a scholar, obviously, but like someone like Edward Baptiste talks a lot about the use of racialism to separate workers as well. And I'm wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, you know, and this is the thing that I think Robin Kelly was saying about this process, like that historically that wasn't the case. Has that become a way to exploit and maintain exploitation, lines of exploitation? Absolutely. This is when I said like racism is the policing of the categories, racially, when I talked to T earlier, racialism is the formation of the categories, right? They're rendering invisible the histories of these cultures, the beauty of Africa, et cetera. Racism is the policing of those categories. So I'll give you a great example. Before, in the 17th century, before Virginia was even a state or commonwealth, and now what is known as the United States, there was a law that was put into effect that if white women married black women or black men or indigenous men, they would lose their status as citizens of the Commonwealth, right? And then that kind of trickled over into the United States. So white women actually lost their US citizenship if they chose to, or if they loved men of color. That's an example of policing that category. Does that make sense, Lisa? That's racism, right? And that's a racism that affects white women. Now, I don't want to center white women being policed, but we can talk about the policing of white bodies, right? We have the great example of John Brown, who was killed for defending Black bodies and his interracial children and his interracial grandchildren. So those kind of lines are that kind of difference. So, so who becomes the police enforcer? Becomes the question. A lot of times it's really beneficial for capitalists for us to become our own self-policers, right? So therefore we become the internalized haters and we, don't associate with people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We see this happening. We see that happening still today. But there were companies that were also police forces, right? Don't hire Black people, right? Or use Black bodies as strike breakers in order to rile up racial resentment. Yes, there's a lot of stuff about that. But what Robinson's trying to say is that it wasn't a tool used after the fact. Race was not the tool used after the fact that capitalism comes into existence. It's that it was through race itself that capitalism becomes constructed. That it's at the site of the origin of capitalism itself. And that's the main difference. Hopefully that helps a little. Cool. Who did I miss?
Next is Ty.
Hey, T, I'm back.
No worries.
This has really been helpful for me because I'm actually co-facilitating a reading group with the Afro-Socialist Caucus where we're going to be reading this book, and we're going a lot slower. We're doing 2 chapters at a time because it's so dense. But before we started, we actually had, if you're familiar with Bill Fletcher, he is an author and an activist, and he came to talk to us, and he was kind of giving us his critiques of Robinson's theory. And I just wanted to kind of get your take on it, because one of his main issues with Black Marxism is that he feels that Robinson is arguing that racism preceded capitalism, which is kind of a perfect segue from the point you were just making. Prejudices and different ethnic conflicts did exist in Europe, as we've talked about tonight, with, for example, the Irish example. And that was very useful in racializing and then constructing racism. But he doesn't really agree with that. He feels that if racism existed before capitalism, then how is it that in the Western Hemisphere, for example, how is it that Pizarro was able to get like a multiracial group of people to defeat the Incas? So I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I mean, as someone who hasn't finished the book yet, it seems to me that it's not really that Robinson is, again, I haven't finished the book. I don't feel like he's arguing that racism preceded capitalism, but the racialization that was going on in Europe facilitated racism being generated alongside capitalism as it evolved. But that's just my take. I don't know if you agree with that at all.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is you're doing a closer reading than Fletcher is. So Fletcher kind of conflates racism and racialization, I think. And that's why I was very deliberate to start with, these are the main differences. They're related, but they're different for a reason. So Robinson's really talking about how does the history of racialization, who was the first race created? White people. White was the first race, not Black. And I think a lot of times, because it's called Black Marxism, we're assuming that it's just about Black people, which it is. It's about the Black radical tradition. It's an excavation. But really, the very first half, and even the first two parts, are a really critical engagement with what we now know as whiteness studies. What does whiteness mean? What does it look like? How is it created? And the whole point is that whiteness was created that was then deployed in other parts of the world to create a global system of white capitalism, of racial capitalism, to benefit whites, right? So that's the way that I would think about it. And we can, there's a really great secondary text to this if you all want to think about this in the form of the context of the United States and the questions of democracy, because this is the DSA, The Abolition of White Democracy by Joel Olson. Tiny book, really tiny book, like 150 pages, tiny book, good book, but it's called The Abolition of White Democracy, and really thinking about how does democracy fit into this question. Right. So, because democracy, and I brought this up earlier when I was talking about ideologies with Hannah. So political ideologies answer the question, what is the purpose of government? Contemporary political ideologies answer the question, what is the purpose of democratic government? Because democracy is this thing as an ideal outside of ideology. Does that make sense? It's kind of like this other phenomenon. Fascism thinks that democracy is stupid. That's its answer. Democracy has no purpose. That's why we have fascism. That's why fascism is democracy's evil twin and tends to be born out of supposedly democratic institutions, right? Hitler was elected. Donald Trump was elected, blah, blah, blah. I can keep going till I'm blue in the face. But the question about what is the purpose of democracy and being different from fascism, we have to start to think about what are the similarities there. Democracy and fascism are both forms of governance that are based in populism. Who are the people? For fascism, the people is a very narrow definition. In Germany, Aryan race, right? How do you make that possible? You erase all the difference. So therefore, if democracy is the flip side of fascism, democracy has to be the celebration of difference. And if you're not celebrating difference, you are not having democracy. So hopefully that makes a little more sense and might be helpful. I know that Robinson's not talking about democracy, right? He's talking about capitalism, but he is a small d Democrat. And I said small d for a reason. Cool. Thank you for Fletcher. Go ahead, Sepida.
Jason is last on stack.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. This has been incredibly clarifying. So I really appreciate this. And I just wanted to ask a couple of related questions. If one, you would consider including in like especially the contemporary power dynamic charts that you were showing, like who holds power and so on and so forth, credit rating agencies and creditors. And then if you do, how that changes, or not changes, but like how do we then take a racial capitalist analysis of the debt economy? And I know there's people like Destin Jenkins and Jackie Wang have been doing some amazing work on this. And I guess the second part of that question would be in terms of resistance then, and maybe this is better suited for your next session, whether or not we shift the focus on the struggle of labor per se and, you know, the boss and the creditor-debtor relation instead, and talk about the ways in which debtors can be or can't be forms or build power of resistance, and how that is also racialized and gendered and all that stuff.
Yeah, a great person, local person, I'm going to name Keeangi-Amata Taylor, Race for Profit, her book. This is exactly her analysis. She's using Robinson's formulation of racial capitalism to think about this, particularly in relationship to the, what was it? The FDA, no, not FDA. the the creditors for home loans, right? We all know what I'm talking about. It's a stupid acronym that I can never remember. But yeah, I think that, and unfortunately, I have not finished reading that book yet, but I want to. I think FHA, yes, thank you so much. I said D, FDA is something else, FHA. But I think that that is absolutely on point. I think that that is completely on point. And people like Keeanga Meta Taylor, people like the ones that you mentioned, people like Astra Taylor, right, who has been organizing amazing work around debt and like the rejection of debt, right? Like just the refusal to pay. And this is really interesting because this gets us back to a classical Marxist point, which is actually Marx's really early work around Hegel. So this is his reading of Hegel's kind of conundrum with the master-slave dialectic. Because when the slave says to the master, you have no power over me anymore, the master disappears. Like he just because the master needs the slave more than the slave needs the master. And this comes back to this is Hegel's point that I think is really important. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that I should add that. I forget to do that. And thank you for doing, because that's really important for me to add that in. And I think that when we think about student loans and the fight over the ratio of student loan debt is so important, because who is it going to affect the most? Students of color. People of color is going to benefit them the most, but then secondarily, it's going to benefit women, and then it's going to benefit everybody, right? So this goes back to, I think, the question that was earlier around, I think Jim's question where we just get down to another discrimination. When Black women get free, we all get free. The Combahee River Collective told us that, right? So at the most base radical formulation of who is the most vulnerable, once their human dignity is centered, the rest of us benefit. We just don't think that. I mean, we know why we don't think that it does, because we're being told that it doesn't. But once we know that the history is the truth, we get a little freer every time. That's what I think. But thank you, Jason. That's really, I'm putting that in there.
Great question. And I believe, I think we closed Stack, and I think that was everyone on Stack. Just doing a real quick check. Yep, Jason was the last one. So yeah, I think we're close to being at time. And if you sat through this and thought, wow, this is really great, I wish I had more, you're in luck. In terms of the next event in our series, that'll be 2 weeks from now. And unfortunately, we don't have an RSVP page, but as soon as I get that created, I'll send it out to everyone that RSVP'd for tonight's session. But the date for that is going to be, and I should have this memorized, it'll be Tuesday, July 27th at 6 p.m.
2 weeks from today.
Yep,
yeah.
2 weeks from
and
today.
I forgot, I threw a quick survey. It's really short. It's 4 questions into the chat. If people can do it for me, it'd be really helpful. It's mostly about what was the muddiest point? What would you like me to review when we get together again before we get into the new stuff and the new material? But yes, I wanted to throw that in real quick, but I'll throw it in at the chat again for if there's too scrolly things, but it's just really, really short survey for me. Thanks. Will it be recorded? The recording being shared?
Oh, yeah. Yep, absolutely. I have to work out some logistics about whether we can put it on our website or YouTube or whatever, but I'll figure that out. Yes, we'll absolutely share the recording with everyone. And one last event update that I wanted to provide. So kind of separate from the series itself, but definitely related. The Philly DSA Racial Justice Committee will be having a meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m. So that is more of a meeting for those that are interested in Philly DSA's work. If you want to see the racial justice element of that work, and also we'll probably have a short debrief about everything we heard in today's awesome session. So if you are able to attend tomorrow, please do. But if not, no worries. Don't forget the second event in the Racial Capitalism series will be on the 27th, in 2 weeks. So yeah, in terms of next steps for us, Dr. Yarish, whenever you're able to, would love to be able to pass along the slides to people who attended. And then I'll also work on getting that recording together and sending that along as well.
Perfect, no worries. I will definitely send that out.
Awesome, thank you. And so I don't, oh yeah, also I'll make sure to email everyone the survey. I know a few people may have left a few minutes early, but I don't have anything else on my end. Doctor, I'll leave you with the last word. Was there anything else you wanted to add, or?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for all your amazing questions. I look forward to reading any lingering questions. There was a box in there for the survey for people if they didn't get around to it before our next session. And I want to thank you all for extending such a great space for me to share and get to talk with you, but talk through the person who helped make this concept more real. But I do want to also say one last thing, which is really important, is that Cedric Robinson popularized this term racial capitalism. He did not create it. It was actually organizers in the apartheid movement in South Africa. So it's really important to remember where these terms come from. And I wanted to make sure I said that out loud before we left today. So thank you so much.
And thank you. And we will all be hopefully hearing more in 2 weeks. So hope to see you all there. And even after that, we'll have some more goodness for you. But see you in 2 weeks. All righty. Thanks, everyone. And if anyone has any questions or anything like that, I'll stay on for another second or so. Thanks, everyone.